from Queen's University Belfast. We have a group of very hardy people who have made it through the torrential rain and the storms in Belfast this afternoon, who are here with us in the room, and we've got lots of other people hopefully are sitting somewhere warmer and drier, joining us through Microsoft Teams. So you're very welcome, no matter which mode you're with us. Let's get started straight away. So today's speaker, I'm delighted to welcome back to Queen's, Dr. Roisín Higgins, who is well known to us here. Roisin is an assistant professor of history and on the leadership team of the Centre for Culture and Creativity at Teeside University. And her work, as many people will know, focuses on social and cultural history with a particular interest in the politics of historical memory. Her book, Transforming 1916, Meaning, Memory and the 50th Anniversary of the Easter Rising, won the prestigious ACIS James Donnelly Prize. And Roisin was involved in many aspects of the centenary of the Easter Rising, including acting as a historical consultant on the commemoration zone of the permanent exhibition at the GPO Witness History. She was also one of the presenters of National Treasures, a public history project run in association with RTE, the National Museum of Ireland, and the Irish Broadcasting Authority in 2018. She has held a Leverhulme Research Fellowship in 2021-22 for her project Sensing the Troubles, a critical reimagining of life in Northern Ireland, which uses sensory history to unlock alternative narratives of the Northern Irish Troubles. And she currently holds an AHRC networking grant for the project towards a socio-somatic history of the Troubles, to bring together academics from a range of disciplines, along with arts practitioners, cultural institutions, and community organisers and advocates. And this network will explore the impact of social systems on the body and how this approach might help to write a different history of conflict. So just before we start, just a reminder that we are recording today's event. So if you don't want to appear on camera, turn your own camera off, and if you keep muted, that would be wonderful. Then we won't get any feedback. There will be an opportunity to ask questions later on, either in the room or online. So we'll get to that in due course. But for now, let's hand over to Roisin, who's going to speak to us this afternoon on the subject of "You didn't see it, but you could hear the echoes and the sounds and silences during the Troubles." Roisin.
Thanks very much, Peter, and thanks for the invitation to speak in Queen's. It's, I suppose, in many ways, the most frightening audience, really, to take this research. You can say what you like, really, in other places. The people trust you. But, okay, so, yeah, I'm going to talk a bit about the project that I've been working on. Dennis grew up in West Belfast on Malcolmson Street off the Springfield Road. Slide. Oh, sorry, I can do that myself. Yeah. I can remember playing on the step of the front door, and I had my toy soldiers and I was playing with them. I remember the footsteps running down the street and two men shouting, "Open your windows, open your windows." So all I can remember is getting pulled in by the scruff of the neck, and the next thing I hear a bomb going off. And that was my first, what I can remember, the first I can remember of the Troubles. Opening the windows let the shock waves of the blast move through. This knowledge stayed with people. Claire was working in London on the 7th of July 2005 when a series of explosives attacked the city, 7/7. She told her colleagues, "We need to open the windows. We will be safer if our windows don't shatter in on us." She marvelled, looking back, that she was using her Northern Irish experience, she said, as something that was a professional skill, almost. There's a strong sense in these memories of learning to withstand the shock, prevent everything from shattering, that tell us something important about living through the Troubles and about the adjustments that are made to accommodate conflict in everyday life. Dennis remembered getting a bar job in the Wellington Park Hotel aged 15. He said going from the Falls Road to the Malone Road was like visiting a different city. Friday and Saturday nights you had Charlie's Disco, and there was this massive buzz and the feel of electricity in the disco, and then you went back to the road again, and it was like this cloak. You had to go back to looking over your shoulder and all. It was like this cloak. It's such a powerful phrase, conveying the sense of being enveloped by the Troubles. So many people I interviewed talk about the relief they felt the first time they left, the memory of crossing the border, or going to England often causes them to exhale and drop their shoulders, as if to signal that before this, they'd been holding their breath. So today I want to talk about my project, Sensing the Troubles, as Peter said, funded by the Leverhulme, and share some of the discoveries of that research to date. The project uses a sensory approach to examine the everyday experience of living in the presence of conflict. The focus is on sensory history because it's through the senses that we meet with and make meaning of the world around us. And so by paying attention to sight, sound, smell, taste and touch, we can move beyond, to some extent, the well-known political narratives and pay attention to individual and also shared experiences. Mark M. Smith, who's a pioneering figure really in sensory history, has argued that wars not only heighten, deaden and stretch the senses, but also create a sensory recognition that smells, touches and sounds in a so much greater salience than they do under ordinary conditions. Those who are sighted often tend to rely on that sense. But in a conflict situation, all of our senses become more alert. Jan Pampler writes in his work on Russia that during revolution, the entire sensorium remained on special alert. People listened, looked, smelled, touched and tasted more attentively in an effort to detect the slightest changes that might signal the next sensorium pandemonium. Or as Finton said to me about the Troubles, everything was intense and everything was rich. It was like a TV with the contrast turned up. Security has lots of sensory aspects. The prevailing sound of helicopters and the heavy smell of diesel from army Saracens being frisked and searched. Lorgan grew up beside the Maze prison. He couldn't see inside, but was aware of the sounds of gates, keys, heavy locks, and dogs barking. Fiona's mother wouldn't leave the house at night. She was so scared of meeting the ghosts of soldiers killed in a nearby atrocity. It's a very vivid portrayal of living with a military presence. So by focusing on the sensory, this research illuminates the complex ways in which lives are touched by violence. It seeks out stories that often remain hidden. And I'm piecing together something approaching, don't want to overstate it, an anatomy of being human during the Troubles through little glimpses, moments and fragments. And of course, it isn't possible to isolate just one sense. Our senses constantly interact. But today I'm going to focus on sound because for many people who lived through the Troubles, the conflict was something they heard even more than it was something they saw. Even for those like Dennis, who lived in the heart of the conflict, he talked about the night Bobby Sands died. I remember it so well, he said. Me and my mummy stayed up all night listening. Everything had erupted around him. So the history I'm writing is populated. I do this because I'm in the process. It certainly isn't done. Is populated by people whose identities are made and unmade, intersecting, connecting, sometimes never meeting. I interviewed 40 people individually and conducted 4 group interviews. And in these interviews, I simply ask people, what could you see, hear, smell? Was there a taste, a touch? And each person begins somewhere differently. The dominance also of sectarianism in the North compels, I think, a search for diversity, a refusal to replicate binary identities and an insistence on understanding more complex ways of being. Most of the people I interviewed were self-selecting, but I did contact advocacy groups and support groups for deaf and blind people and sought out members of the LGBT+ community, ethnic minorities and people from a geographical spread, because I wanted to have a really rich mixture of experiences represented. During the Troubles, members of the population veered between intense encounters and desensitization, and there was recourse for many to self or prescription medication. In comparisons of European countries, it was shown that Northern Ireland ranked third. I don't know what was going on in Denmark and Iceland in 1980 in the prescribing of tranquilizers. And many of you may be familiar with the 2011 report into mental health repercussions of the Troubles that found that 39% of the study sample had experienced a conflict-related trauma. And yet, and we can see this clearly in the literature, there was a refusal on the part of many health researchers and professionals right up to the 1990s to acknowledge that living through the Troubles was an unusual experience. And Ian Miller has just published an article in Social History, which tries to understand that, what were the politics of that refusal. Siobhan McAllister and Claire Dyer from this parish have, with others, done really important work on young women in post-conflict Northern Ireland. In their 2021 article, they argued that by employing the idea of the sensed experiences of war, hearing, seeing and feeling conflict, they have been able to illuminate the ways in which young women were touched by violence beyond physical attacks. Oh, so it's not working on yours. Sorry, I just didn't realise that's the right one. Sorry, I was looking at this. There's a stickiness to this sensed experience of violence, they write. Hearing and seeing the impacts of violence is long lasting, hard to shift, and leaves its mark. So this approach, by focusing on the senses, it expands the focus of research beyond spectacular violence, beyond fatalities, beyond catastrophic injury. It's not that it doesn't include that, but it expands that understanding of what it's like to live with conflict. The ordinary violence, the verbal violence, the visual violence, the hearing of violence. And in that way, it recovers some of the stories and has a broader understanding of the impact. One woman I interviewed sent me a follow-up email on the anniversary of Bloody Friday. She wrote, "I remember very clearly being in the back seat of our car, sitting behind my dad with my brother beside me. It was a nice day, a Friday, and best of all, pocket money day, so we got to the sweet shop. Someone Dad knew came over to the car and spoke to him through the window. He said something like, 'Have you heard what happened in Belfast today?' I don't remember the exact words, but I remember the tone. It was as if he couldn't quite believe what he was telling my parents. It was one of those times when the anxiety level went up and all the adults became very serious. We got home and my parents put on the news. Even at 6 years old, I knew what I was seeing was frightening and awful." And then she wrote, "Today I feel closer to that small child than ever. Through my 20s, 30s, and even 40s, I told myself that I wasn't directly affected by what happened. I wasn't in the thick of it, and my family escaped much of the violence. I remember happy day trips, normal school experiences, boring teenage years in a small town where I longed to be grown up and leading an exciting life. Then an anniversary like this pops up, and I'm taken instantly to the backseat of a car outside a sweet shop on a sunny day where the adults can't comprehend what is happening to their lives, and the anxiety is real and instant and overwhelming." This is such a rich email. It captures the juxtaposition of happy everyday life, punctured by the sharing of news. And it also suggests one of the most important sounds of the Troubles, a discordant note, a tone, or a register which conveys bad news, shock, anxiety, resignation, disbelief, warning. As Fiona said to me, that's what I've always found. The most awful things happen when you're doing the most mundane things. What we also see in this email is the shift from then to now, the young person to the older, and the memory of an experience that connects the two. The experience of memory is sometimes unexpected, perhaps prompted by news coverage during an anniversary, tied sometimes but not always to a specific event. but it's not a linear process. It's the memory of a child in a moment. There were louder sounds too, of course, that were aggressive, insistent, like the banging of bin lids that vibrated so that Martin, who is completely deaf, woke out of his sleep. It was an amazing interview because I needed a translator, and it was a non-verbal expression of everything that was going on, and so he represented that night. He talked about that, about being woken up, and the whole scene is about sound, and he didn't make a sound, and yet it was one of the most articulate and expressive representations of that event you can imagine. Some sounds can permeate our whole bodies and be so life-changing that they stay held there. Someone I'll call Jim was 4 years old when he witnessed his father being shot in 1972. I remember standing in the street and hearing the gunshots, he told me. I can still hear them to this day. I can still hear them, and it wasn't until I grew up I found out that they came from a Thompson machine gun, and that sound sticks in my head too. It's mad. I have a colleague, an artist, Mikhail Karakis, who worked on a project near an industrial processing plant in Italy. And after his first night there, the owner of the B&B asked him how he'd slept. And Mikhail said the noise of the plant kept him awake. And his host told him that the people of the village could no longer hear it. We have incorporated it, he said. It had become part of them. I think in some ways the Troubles absorbed, with the Troubles, people absorbed so much of it. It seemed that large parts of it were gone. But in fact, it became part of their corpus, their body. They took it in and they carried it around with them. So I'm interested in listening to what has been absorbed, to allow that what had been minimized or dismissed or not acknowledged to be heard. Colm, who was talking about the heavy military presence, I'm probably, where am I with this? Oh, sorry. I always do with the slides, I'm always behind. The heavy military presence in South Armagh said, so the British Army, were always there, but there was never ever a point where you turn as a child and say, my God, look, there's troops. Oh my God. You just didn't. It was taken the way we take sunsets and all that there. It was no big deal. Taken the way we take sunset. I mean, honestly, sometimes people, there are just so many phrases. The Leverhulme Fellowship has been transformative for me in terms of my work as a historian, but it has also undoubtedly changed me, I think, as a person. That great practitioner of oral history, Alessandro Portelli, notes that in the interview, we are the co-authors and the co-creators of a document that, to some extent, is about us as well as about the person, the persons we interview. And it would not have existed if we hadn't been there. This, he argues, is not a weakness, but a strength. So in each interview, there is a space created in between. And it is above all else about human connection. And that's why oral history interviews can offer such, I think, a profound experience. And I found this paper very difficult to write because my mind is flooded in many ways. Like I realized I'm carrying around all of these voices and all of these stories. I feel this huge responsibility. I don't want to let the participants down, and I don't want to edit them out. And I just struggled with how to put it together in a way that would do justice to them. I haven't figured it out yet, but I'll have to. I've said it will, so I'll have to. Jim was a taxi driver, and I interviewed him in a cafe. He's the one whose father was shot at the gates between the Falls and the Shankill. I always let people pick the venue, and then I worried the whole time about the acoustics. Some of them, I don't know how the transcribers heard them. Because a lot of people quite like to meet in a cafe. They say, oh no, there's a cafe, it's quite quiet. So it's like, you know, to record. Anyway, we met in a cafe, and he told me that he'd heard about the project when he was getting support filling in a PIP form for disability. And he explained to the person who was helping him that he was getting counselling and that he could still remember the smell of the British Army uniforms being in the house 50 years ago. And the person helping him said, "I know a girl that'll want this." And Jim told me, that's how it came about. He was talking to me. That's how it came about. I was getting a form filled in. And so I met people in all kinds of, or people contacted me in all kinds of different ways. So it's been really amazing. So Jim told me about his experiences over a cup of tea. And towards the end, he said, "See, if I talk about it this much in depth, I get drained. See, by the end of tonight, when I go home, I'll be really, really tired when I talk about it. Every time I go to counselling for the hour, I'd be exhausted after it mentally. It must suck all the energy out of me. It can take a lot of energy and strength to carry heavy memories. It is, I think, an awareness of this that sowed the seeds of this project for me. It began with a curiosity about what gets held in the body, because we remember with our whole bodies, not just our minds. And for me, a seminal moment was reading the article by Arthur Kleinman and Joan Kleinman, How the Body Remembers. It was written in 1994, and Kleinman's a neuroscientist and an anthropologist. And in undertaking work on the Cultural Revolution in China, he sought to understand and analyse the relationship between the body and society, the sociosomatic. I invited him to be, I don't know what age he is now, but to be part of the network, the AHRC network, but he declined, but he said, "I'm thrilled." The word is still being used. So the Kleinmans wrote symptoms of social suffering. So they're interested in understanding how those social systems cross over from the public and from the external into the body, and then how that manifests itself. So those symptoms of social suffering, those like chronic illness, and the transformations they undergo are cultural forms of lived experience. They are lived memories. That is to say, bodies transformed by political processes not only represent those processes, they experience them as the lived memory of the transformed worlds. The experience is of memory processes. And I think this is what really caught my attention. Memory processes sedimented in gait, posture, movement, and all the other corporeal components which together realize cultural code and social dynamics in everyday practices. The memorialized experience merges subjectivity in the social world. You know, and we can see it. We can see it on people. We can see grief. We can see poverty. We can see pain. And I suppose I wanted to find a way to bring that in, really. So the challenge for me was to find a way to bring it into the center of the historical narrative, so that there isn't the story and then these individual cases, that it's about that's the story. And so this is what drew me to sensory history, because it allows us to explore multiple elements of society in a very intricate and indeed intimate way. It's funny, you know, with sensory history, one of the things, well, maybe we'll be repeating myself later, but one of the things that drew me to it was it's a really interesting way to talk about inequality. And some of the great work that's been done with sensory history is on racism and constructions of race, which they're not rational, they're kind of based on all these subjective sensory things. And so I thought, oh yes, that's a good way to talk about inequality and discrimination, and people won't necessarily see it coming. you know. So I was sure I was going to write this kind of hard, kind of sharp experience. So I mean, it's been transforming for me in many ways. I'm not going to write a sharp history now. And it's partly having interviewed people, it's partly that human connection. But sensory history does allow you to look at those kinds of the way in which division is constructed. In their recent work, Emotion, Sense and Experience, Rob Bottis and Mark M. Smith argue that an approach to scholarship, which is an evaluation of the entanglement of emotions and senses, mind and body, propels us towards a fuller, more textured understanding of the practices of being human. Margaret, who was born totally blind, described hearing as how a sighted person would describe using their eyes. Sitting, listening to Margaret, I became increasingly aware of my own limitations, how little I thought about my own sensory responses, and how alive Margaret was to hers. I mean, it's something that's often said, isn't it, about people who are blind, that they have a great sense of, you know, they hear really well. And when I was sitting listening to her, I thought, no, that isn't it. It's because I'm dulled. It's not because a blind person has heightened senses. It's because sighted people just aren't using what they, you know, well, I don't know, I can't speak for everybody else, but for myself, I thought, I'm getting all this information all the time and I'm not thinking about it. But if you're blind, you do think about it. You know, when I said to Margaret, when I say touch, what comes up for you? And she said, touch is everything for me. Touch is how I read. It's how I knew that my children were safe. You know, and it was mesmerizing. And I felt that she had a real gift in that, you know, and had given me one too. And for several decades, the field of sensory history had a similar tendency. It was heavily influenced by the work of Marshall McLuhan and Walter Ong, which held that sight had become the dominant sense in the West during the modern period, following the invention of the printing press, the intellectual underpinnings of the Enlightenment, and an emphasis on science and reason. There's been a great deal of work since that, which has tried to nuance and confront that idea to some extent, but still in terms of research, the focus leans towards the visual. You can see that. But as I said at the beginning, with conflict, there is a shift in emphasis. Emily Thompson has described soundscape as both a world and a culture constructed to make sense of that world. Claire lived with her grandmother, parents and siblings in a middle-class suburb of Belfast. She remembered, my grandmother came home from her last operation and then we had 4 months of her bedridden through the summer holidays, and it was 1970. So just the early days of the Troubles. You could see from her bedroom window, you could see columns of smoke, you could hear rioting, and you could hear bin lids and things. So there was a lot of conversation about this while she was dying. So you can see how external sounds intruded and were woven through conversation into intimate personal moments, the meaning making adding to the sounds. Hampler has also written about the sensory experience of one's situatedness in the urban environment and how that's determined by sound. In Russia during the revolution, he noted gunshots were a particular source of orientation. And Julia Obert, in her work on the politics of sound in Northern Irish poetry, notes that acoustic scaffolding helped locals to move safely through place. Even when the city is uncannily illegible, it is not yet entirely inaudible. I have a sound clip. I'm not sure how that's going to work. Will it? It's the next one.
So if we click on the...
Oh, so I just...
mouse.
Oh,
Shall I click on?
yes. See if this works. So in Claire's house, she said in the kitchen, you could hear bombs going off that you hadn't heard when you were all clustered around the television. That may be in this clip. I struggled a little bit with my editing. Not just the editing.
something.
I didn't want to get through the whole thing. Some people I'm reading them because they want to be anonymous, and so I just don't want to reveal their identities. But is somebody? This is probably one of the places where somebody might know them. But I know in oral history presentations, kind of you'd be expelled from the oral history. Try to play at least one other person's voice. But I may have to live with the expulsion.
You may have to.
Yeah. Oh, I see. Right. Okay.
Sorry.
That's okay. So you could hear when you went into the kitchen, it was kind of interesting. So their living room was in the center of the house. I mean, even as people are talking in this way, you get a real sense of where they live, that kind of space when they tell you these things. And so she says, while you were waiting for the kettle to boil, you would hear whether it was a bad night or an easy night. And the helicopters, of course, which were just constant for most of my teenage years, really. And then if there was a bomb that was loud enough for you to hear it in the living room while you were watching TV, you knew it was either very close or a very bad one. And that did happen many, many nights. So then you would turn on the police radio to hear really crackly, but you could hear them giving the reports of where they were going. So you would know whether they were coming here or not. But you didn't do anything, you didn't react. Maybe we went up to the windows, but I don't remember anything that you could really see at night. You couldn't even maybe see columns of smoke or anything like that. You were just aware that this was happening. Sound was used to situate and assess danger and as an important form of orientation, all while you were waiting for the kettle to boil. Alison from Larne explained, because again, somebody you knew might have been involved, so that judging distance by noise, trying to understand how big a bomb it might be, what the impact might be, were important. Crucially, also, as McLuhan and his co-author Carpenter pointed out, the soundscape is a sphere without fixed boundaries. Space made by the thing itself, not space containing the thing. So, as Obart then notes, sound can therefore slip across borders and across borders that bodies cannot or will not cross, transgressing strictly policed visual divides. And you know, she talks about the peace walls and the sound that goes over them, and that you know, that it's those are a shared space in some ways. Sonically, it's a shared space, not every day of the year. And one striking example, I suppose, of this is the sound of helicopters. A woman from the Shankill who oh.
Well, we could try from here.
Well, I've got more.
Okay.
You don't want to hear that again, or do you want to?
Well, I can play this one.
Oh, I see. Right, I'm not ready for that. Just
okay,
that.
Right.
Brilliant. Oh, excellent. Oh, yes. Below that's a sound effect rather than a person. Let's see. I actually hope there were no sound experts here because they'd be appalled at the quality of the sound. Anyway, so yes, this woman from a women's group on the Shankill, and she talked about, they were talking about helicopters, and she said, you know, I didn't notice them. I didn't ever notice them until her children were born. And then she said the babies wouldn't sleep. So she phoned the barracks and said, you're going to have to do something about that sound. So she said, yeah, it wasn't effective, but she said that's how bad it got. No, this is a little experimental. Okay, so what do we see? Several people mentioned the sound of helicopters, but Colin described it. Run VT. So he said, I'm going to do him because Colin isn't his real name. But the Wessex with this helicopter it was like a heavy hitter. I mean, its engines were like boom, 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 or it was like vroom, vroom, vroom. Actually, it took the way he did the way he did it. He stood up and he went vroom, 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 and it shook the ground. It was obnoxious in its entrance. It announced itself from like 5 minutes away and just got louder and louder and louder. It had a big exhaust pipe out the side. I remember that. It was like this big exhaust pipe, and because the barracks was built in amongst the houses, probably deliberately, definitely deliberately, you saw this all day, every day coming in. You could see the fumes coming out of the exhaust. The noise just permeated everything. It was a dull, heavy, obnoxious thud, perpetual thud. It definitely could shake tiles off rooftops and all the rest. Your childhood growing up there was just that noise all the time, just all the time. And they would come in from so many different angles. They would come in over the football pitch. I don't know if they had any less obnoxious way of landing things. There you are, the BBC Sound Archive. The sound of news was also heard across a wide geographical space. One participant who lived in a small town said it did become part of your everyday life. Hearing somebody shot, a bomb going off here, it was just what was in the news day and daily. I mean, I don't remember feeling sort of scared or anything. Martin from Mahara said, we weren't news. Our generation, I think we were news addicts. I still remember the sort of jingle for downtown for the news coming on, and that would have been on in our house. We'll skip that sound thing. Unless, Peter, do you want to sing the downtown?
No.
I can still remember it myself. A conversation with a group of women in Barron Hall Community Centre had everyone reminiscing about the news. Wherever you'd have been, whenever you'd been watching the news or watching the TV, you know, Scene Around 6 or whatever it was you were watching, you know, and the live reports, and then it would come up. Could all key holders in Belfast please come back to this? This is a short little audio. Does anyone recognise this? I must say, it didn't ring a bell for me. Scene Around 6.
Love that one.
Yes. And so then this other woman said, what you said about Scene Around 6, that theme tune should come into my head now. I think, you know, I mean, I listened more to the news in that time than I ever did when COVID was on and everything else, you know. But that Scene Around 6, I think we were all, because we didn't have social media and because it was what was either on the telly or my mum always had the radio on in the kitchen, the radio in the kitchen. That was the sound, you know, it was always on. As you say, you know, it would have been maybe Radio 2 up until the hour, and then it would have been quick, let's get Radio Ulster on and see what's happening or whatever. But yeah, Scene Around 6, I think everybody sort of, you stopped to watch it. A sonic lexicon developed, which included keynotes, the sounds created by the geography of the landscape, signals, foreground signals, that are listened to consciously, and sound marks or sonic landmarks. It was Finton's familiarity with his landscape that allowed him, where are we? No, sorry. To hear the smallest sounds. Soldiers were often dropped from Chinook from the top of the mountain. And he said, when you live in the country, you hear everything. You know, you could lie in bed and I could tell roughly whose car's coming up the road. You know, you're just attuned to that, really. So those noises you'd hear that weren't there before, the chink in the wee bit of metal slapping against the rifle, you know, every now and then you'd hear a bit of breathing, or you could hear a footstep, and you know it. You know what a cow sounds like. You know what a sheep sounds like, because you're terrified from the age of 6 or 7. You're walking in the dark 2 miles up the road. And of course, there were the sounds of bombs, lots of descriptions. people have given me of the sound of bombs. Fiona from South Down said she became aware of that she had this kind of knowledge when she travelled. And those around her thought a loud bang was a bomb and she knew it wasn't. She said, just because you grew up with it and you knew what the difference was, you always knew. There were silences around bombs too. Fiona said of an explosion that hit her home. You couldn't see. There was just so much falling. It's that just sort of, or it's nearly like all your other sensations because you can't see and there doesn't seem to be any noise. And you're just trying to figure out what's going on. And all you can smell is dust and concrete. Margaret remembered a bomb at work. Let's see now, can we get Margaret? See if this works. We can, and sorry, Margaret's the woman who's blind. So, I mean, all of those things, when you think of the disruption and those, trains being diverted and buses being put on, and for somebody who's blind, it was just so much more difficult than it was for everybody else. I think sometimes I don't know, I don't. I think sometimes we don't remember that, whatever, in the general stories. And there were other silences. Nina from India said, you heard, you didn't even open your mouth because you could not have taken one side and then the other side. But slowly, I think slowly, after maybe 15, 20 years of being in this part of the world, I think you start to build your confidence. And then you just sort of see and you just talk about it and what you were thinking at the time. But before that, you dare not. No, I would not have. I would have been so scared. So just that kind of fear of saying the wrong thing. And again, it's thinking about the breadth of that experience. When you think of somebody who's, that was such an interesting interview as well, thinking of all of the kind of the adjustments and the sensory differences when you come from India. Marilyn Charles has written that traumatic memory is often spoken through gaps and ellipses, through what is missing rather than what is present, what can't be articulated. I met John in a small function room in a pub in Carrickfergus. He had taken great care to make sure everything was right, in a way that I was very moved by it. It was a really kind of gentle curation of the space. John's father had been shot dead. A car pulled up outside their house and two men shot him 5 times in front of John, who was 8 years old. So John said, people say time slows down, and in that situation, and one or two others since, yeah, it does. Everything slows down to about 1/10 of the speed, but your movements become slow. And I just remember, I don't even remember going to the gate. And it's the interview, there are some really vivid moments in it, and then it's just fractured with all of the trauma. John has suffered with complex PTSD since and talked with extraordinary eloquence. I mean, it really was extraordinary about what that's like and how he experienced it. He said to me, do you see the next time you're in agony? Not that I hope you ever will be. Try screaming without making a sound, because I done that to protect my family. I done that. Whenever I started to self-harm back as a teenager because of the anger building up, the frustration, I'll be honest, it's not until this year that I realised I was experiencing pain. It has taken me 32 years to even identify that emotion because no one ever told me. I always call this raw emotion, but it's not raw, it's pain. And in many ways, the silence of those screams have stayed with me. And I've thought about them a lot since. And about the inequality of suffering and the extremes of what has been absorbed. Towards the end of my conversation with Jim, sorry, am I behind? Oh, no, it's not, sorry. He said, that's what I'm saying to you, Roisin. You see, going to school, hearing shootings, hearing bombs, you just look down the street and went on to school, and you see it on the way back out of school again. Riots, shooting, bombings was normal. You went home and you got your dinner and you went to bed and you got up the next morning and you just lived it. It was just normal. The helicopters that are hovering, that noise, you were able to sleep through it. You just went to sleep. But now when there's one up there, now you go, what the fuck's wrong? And it was just normal then. And then he said, and then I said, sorry, I suppose that's the other thing for me about this, doing this, like talking to people. I think people tuned out a lot. He said they did. And I said, but they still, and he said, it's in there. I said, it's in there. And he said, it's in there and it's starting to come back on people now, I think. And I said, I think so. And he said, it is. It definitely is.
Roisin, thank you for that wonderful presentation. Very emotive and very challenging as well. A lot to discuss, a lot to think about in there. Sorry for the technical glitches, but we got through. We got the helicopter sounds anyway, which is the important thing. So there's an opportunity now for to ask some questions. So if you're in the room, obviously just raise your hand. If you're online, if you see there's a reactions button on your screen, if you press that and then press the little hand icon, that will just raise your hand digitally and let me know that you want to ask a question. So do we have anybody who'd like to start? Yeah.
They'll be archived. They'll be archived in Teeside for a start. It's difficult though because of the anonymity. So redacted transcripts will all be available, but some of the archive will be, it's there, I suppose, so that things can be verified, and some of it will be available publicly through the pure system at Teeside.
So we have a question online from Sharon. So Sharon, if you want to unmute yourself and go ahead.
Hi, Roisin. That was absolutely wonderful, having experienced all of those sounds and sights and feelings during the Troubles. I just wondered, you said you don't know how to do the transcripts justice. Have you considered some way of creating a book whereby they are creatively presented, like a series of short stories or plays?
That's a great idea. I hadn't thought of it that way. I mean, I know myself that there is a limit to what I can do. And so I'm kind of excited about what arts practitioners or what other people might do with the material. And so, yeah, I would kind of look forward to that as a kind of a collaboration. But I hadn't thought of it in that way. That's really interesting. Thanks.
We need to talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Okay. Another question online from Kate. You want to go ahead?
Hello, that was a fantastic lecture speech. I loved it. That was just wonderful. My question is, did you find that your participants did they show any kind of sensory issues or problems? Were they touchy-feely or specifically not touchy-feely, anything like that?
No, I wasn't aware of that, to be honest. Some of them I suppose it was still we were just coming out of COVID. So, yeah, so sometimes that, I suppose, although I met this wonderful woman in Portadown, and again, she said, oh, just come to my home. And I was thinking, oh, well, she want me to be masked, whatever. And she opened the door and I said, I've never been to Portadown before. I mean, I've been through it in the train, but I said, I've never been to Portadown before. And she said, welcome to the Garvaghey Road. Gave me a big hug. So, I mean, people were warm, but no, I didn't. No, I didn't have any sort of sense of that, of what you're suggesting.
Yeah, the back.
Thank you so much. That was really thought-provoking, and at times, like, I don't know if this is the exact right word, but very visceral, very real, tangible. You spoke a little bit about demographics in the selection process for your sample. Wondering if you could say just like a little bit more, like maybe like average age for people, sort of a little bit more of the background. Obviously, anonymity is important for this project, but just if you could just say a little bit more.
So the idea was, I suppose, I kind of put out a call, anybody over 35. So it was really just anybody who lived during the Troubles. I would say the average age is probably, would it be 50? Might be a bit older than that. It's actually, what I realized is it's a lot of people who are at a point of reflection, really, and who actually did want to talk about, I suppose, that growing awareness or the cost of it, and actually quite a few people who want it, who feel that by telling these stories, they, do a little bit to make sure it doesn't happen again. That actually seemed to be quite an impulse for people. But yes, it's not a social science. I mean, again, there's so many organizations I'll be throwing out of the oral history. It isn't, and I don't want to say that in a kind of cavalier way, because I worried about, but I also, to be honest, it has been a really interesting process for me, and I just struggled at the beginning with it, and then I just decided to be open to whatever came up, because it's such a strange thing to ask people, or it's not strange, but I mean, I got somebody to interview me. That was terrible. Like, I just, honestly, there's nothing interesting in it. And so it takes a very particular kind of person, I think, to be interested and to want to sit down and to really think about their experiences in that way. So it worked best when people approached me.
That's great. Actually, I have some really unfocused kind of question really about how you're approaching this in terms of your disciplinary background. Obviously, your work in collaboration, I think, is brilliantly interdisciplinary, but I'm wondering about the divisions between approaching this as a historian and approaching this subject from the perspective of memory studies, and whether you even think about your work in those kind of specific disciplinary frames of reference, whether that's useful or not. And I'm also thinking very much, probably countless studies that are about history, memory, and trauma. And it seems to me like the historiography, certainly on trauma, seems to be quite divisive, with some historians who embrace the idea of trauma and getting a trauma through history or through memory. But there's this little body of historical thought that kind of says, well, if historians aren't actually, we're not trained medical professionals, we don't even sometimes actually define clearly what trauma is, and we use it more as a kind of a metaphor. So I'm just sort of sassy about trauma, actually, but I'm just wondering about coming at this as a historian or in terms of memory studies, and whether the idea of trauma, how much you've sort of thought about as maybe a problematic kind of issue, because presumably that's what's coming through a lot of your interviews.
It is, yeah. That's really it's a great question. Thank you. I mean, I suppose in some ways it was really important for me to do this as a historian. I feel like history is it has a lot of influence as a discipline, and in Ireland can be a very conservative discipline. So I wanted to write it within that discipline. I wanted it to be recognizable to people in some ways as a history, but at the same time, actually, probably the whole process, it has become much more, I'm much more interested in the story and certainly not in the verification. I mean, some people will get, I mean, inevitably they'll get a year wrong, or they'll, you know, have to sit in my hands and just, but you know, so I'm interested in the way the story is told. I mean, you know, history and memory, they're two different routes to the past, really. And so I don't feel there's a conflict in me in that regard, but yes, I may, it turns out the historian's another club, I might, yeah, it may not be as recognizable, but I want to write it as a history because well, maybe because that's where you can have an influence on the discipline, but also because that's what the readership, what an audience might be more comfortable with or understand. I don't want to say that in any dismissive way of, it's just where it's, I think it's important where it's situated. And so, but beyond that, I don't feel bound by the discipline of history in any major way. So I'm quite happy to learn from and play around the edges with it. And with this, I feel glad to be at a point in my career, I suppose, when I can have a bit of fun with it in terms of what I want to do with it, the material itself is not, but to be creative with it. That's a long-winded way to say it. But in terms of trauma, it's interesting because I didn't know myself. Firstly, I thought that trauma is useful in terms of form because it's fragmented. And I thought, I'm not writing a coherent, cohesive narrative. I'm writing a fragmented one. So I'll take that as a kind of a way to explore that. So from that point of view, trauma has been quite informative. And then, of course, the other thing that's happened is I've had conversations with people I've interviewed about trauma and their experience or how they would define it, and somebody who's written a PhD on trauma. And I thought, well, thank you very much. That's how I can do it in a way that doesn't get overly academic, that doesn't get really, it is about the conversations I've had with people around the issue. So I won't pretend it isn't there. But you're right, it's not that I'm qualified or that I want to get into that particular, I don't want to get into a battle with anybody over it. You know?
Okay, I'm going to go to Eamon next and then Gail online. So Eamon first.
Thank you. As everybody else has said, it's incredibly rich paper. But I mean, I suppose it's kind of follow up to what Carol was asking. What I mean, this is not only a question of asking a historian or I'm a historian, but what kinds of ethical considerations did you have? Did you bring an estimate committee? What kinds of issues did they raise when you did?
I did. I had to put it through. I'm in a social science. Well, the people on the ethics committee were social scientists, and I suppose fortunately, I didn't feel particularly fortunate at the time, but where I worked in Teeside, there was a very strong kind of special, you know, a very strong focus on vulnerable people, and so the ethics were very rigorous in those terms. So, you know, not just has been consent been given, but how do you know the person is able to give consent? So it was quite, I had to answer a lot of questions and have a very detailed information sheet and consent form. I mean, I often looked at it and thought, if somebody give me that, I would say, look, I'm not trying to give you a kidney, you know, but so it was. I suppose it's funny because that's just the paperwork, you know. The real issue then for me was, would I, because I'm not there afterwards to help the person for whom something might have come up, but actually, and it's not, I suppose I don't know this as 100% certainty, but I have a pretty good sense that everybody I spoke to has either spoken quite a lot if it's a significant trauma, and or hadn't ever really talked. You know, I spoke to a nurse who'd heard me on the radio, and actually there was real release for her. So she didn't, you know, she wasn't upset, but she was kind of amazed. I think that's what a lot of people, they're amazed at what they went through, and that nobody had ever really thought it was particularly interesting before. And quite a few people have said to me afterwards they felt lighter. So yes, but so I wasn't confronted with anybody where I felt really, you know, oh no, I've taken on something, I've blundered in here, and I have, yeah, that didn't happen.
Okay, Gail, if you're there.
I'm sorry. This is, I confess, more of a comment than a question. It's not even a question at all. Just to say how much I enjoyed that research and was really moved by it, which is a lovely thing when it's academic research on a Monday afternoon. A couple of observations. I suppose one of the things is, you know, some of the most moving parts in what you did was where you really brought yourself into it and spoke about your willingness to involve yourself in the research and to be kind of part of it. And another thing, I suppose, is to say that I really understand the desire to write it as a, well, to write it at all, to make the output a book, if you like, and to write that oral history. But I think that it must have other translations and embodied ones, you know, performance for the stage, maybe dance, maybe something with lots of things with sound, immersive experiences. There's so many things that can be done. And my sense with this work is that, yes, other people can pick that up and do it, but there'll be new things for you to learn in the translation of the material to different forms. So like with me in The Sun is Open, one of the things, I learned one thing writing the poems, but I've learned something entirely different having to stand and embody the work by breathing the poems and to speak them in a room and to be physically present and to say the words that I've written. It's like it's been an extraordinary thing. And the same thing will happen to you actually when you have to communicate your own research in other kinds of forms, and then embodied ones actually, and then sensory ones. So it's really just to say, I think what you're doing is so exciting, and I hope that you will be as playful as you want to be, and not leave it to other people, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you saying that. I mean, in some ways, it's I just wanted to acknowledge my own limitations and feel that I don't own it, you know. Even though I'm a part of it, it's a big part of me now, you know. But yeah, I want so it would be, I suppose, collaborations. Yeah. So, but that's a really nice thing to say. It's very exciting when you put it like that.
It's your curiosity that's kind of brought these stories out. So yeah, a collaboration that's, yeah, to express it in another way would be another exciting thing. So I'll be watching the project with interest.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gail. Questions? Anyone else? Yes, Becky.
Thank you so much. This was really thought-provoking. One of the things when you were talking about Margaret, I believe it was, who was blind, reminded me of an experience that I had working as in somewhat of a personal assistant capacity for a short time for a woman who is blind, and how that experience made me a lot more conscious, literally when I was in her presence and working with her, of other sensory aspects. For example, one of the first times I met her, you know, she commented on a scent of like a lotion or something, and you know, we kind of talked about that, and specifically in her office in general, people try not to have, you know, heavy perfumes and things because of maybe more of a sensitivity, and I found myself being maybe a little bit more deliberate in my words or noises I was making, you know, just reflecting on the fact that she would be more focused on that. So anyway, my question is that I wonder, you spoke both about interviewing her, and then that there was also another participant who was deaf and having, you know, a translator there. But I wonder, as the interviewer, were you sort of maybe more self-aware or even self-conscious of some of your own senses, not just in terms of sort of how you were taking things in, but maybe in the signals that you might have been conveying, working with people who would be, you know, focused on some of your those different senses. I'm not sure if that totally makes sense.
No, it does. It completely made sense. I mean, really, I just felt I learned so much. I mean, it was, and you know, I had an aunt who was blind, so it's not. Yes, I knew to speak all the time. You know, so it wasn't that was unfamiliar, but I hadn't ever sat down with my aunt and said, "Talk to me about what it's like." And with that conversation, we talked for a long time before she talked about the troubles, because I was just interested in, yeah, I suppose, I mean, it's, yeah, I wanted to know what it was like to be her, and that it was true of everybody, and that's, I think, what's really has been very meaningful about this research, that it's asking people what was going on for you, not on the newspapers, not the, you know, around you. And so it was similar. But yeah, I had a real awareness of communication, of all the different ways in which we communicate. I suppose you're right. And yeah, I mean, that was I thought a lot about that interview afterwards and what I learned, and not all of it about the troubles at all. And then there's certainly the interview with I've done 2 interviews with people who are deaf, and it's just, you know, it's a terrible limitation. It's a terrible limitation on my part. It's, you know, when you think of accessibility and, you know, so I'm actually working with the woman who translated the interviews and with a woman in Teeside to write good practice, because I didn't even know. It's like, well, you know, I kind of blundered into it, and it's, well, actually, it'd probably be good if somebody just said, "This is what you do," you know, you know, this is what you need to do in order to have a good quality, best practice interview. So yeah, I think those interviews have brought a lot into my experience and my work.
Yeah, Miles.
Yeah, on that, what you just said, you know, you said during your presentation, thank you for its very powerful presentation, that you didn't want to write a sharp history. That, and you talked about your passion to these people's stories. It sounds like this whole project has been transformative for you in how you do history. Would that be correct?
I think that is true. Yeah. And that isn't always easy. You know, it hasn't always been, you know, I've worried a lot. It's weighed on me sometimes. And then other times I feel so fortunate, you know, I feel almost released to, you know, to think that actually my responsibility is to this work. It isn't to even what other people will think, you know, or how it'll be judged in academic terms. But yeah, so it definitely has. It's a huge part of my life now, I suppose.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Are signs of danger in rural areas contrasted with flights of Finland's in urban areas? I wonder if they put more to the dynamics.
Sorry,
The dynamics.
yeah, I suppose because actually the experience of the countryside is one that doesn't, I suppose it isn't as spoken about on maybe the border lands, and I suppose because I wanted to write something about everyday life. Now there's a heavy Belfast emphasis. I went over, I did 2 group interviews in the Museum of Free Dairy as well, to, you know, so I have those kind of big urban stories. But it's the listening is really interesting in the countryside, the hearing across fields, the sense of land and landscape is so much more expansive. And I think, yeah, just that kind of geography and the relationship to the land, I think that there's a different quality to those kinds of interviews, that kind of connection. I mean, even when the woman I'm calling Fiona, because a lot of people, it's interesting, it's partly they may say something like, my mother wouldn't leave the house at night because she was scared she'd meet ghosts, and then that's it. The whole, in many ways, and I knew it when the whole interview then has to really be anonymized if I'm allowed, if that point is going to be there. And so yes, that space as haunted, I think, is a different relationship with the space. Maybe, but I think that with, compared to a crowded urban space, yeah, I've not said anything very interesting. I'm sorry. I'm trying. I haven't come up with anything. But again, it's kind of trying to find that mixture. The people who have experienced something very traumatic very often have told their story, and that's the kind of that's who people sometimes directed me towards. And so it wasn't that I didn't want that, but I also wanted the people, and I had quite a few of them, and I always loved it whenever people would say, I don't know why you want to interview me, I've got nothing to say. Yes, you do. So yeah, and so those quiet country experiences are hard to get, but important.
Okay, I think we could take one more, maybe two more questions. Yeah, we've got two over here. Go ahead.
Working, worst of it. For me, it's a sensory word. Side is my sensory. Narrative behind the work on the side.
Right.
That's generally scale. So is there anybody, do you have anybody dealing with diversion or sensory overload is the big thing?
That's the one, not the one group, there are loads. No is the answer to that. And I did kind of hashtag and and that's not maybe the way, but that was a really effective way to get people. Thank God if this done now that Twitter goes down. And then it meant it was very random. It was a kind of it is random, it's not scientific at all, but no. But I would be very interested in talking to anybody who
does what you've done give you any thoughts about kind of museums or exhibitions that include all the senses, but in particular the sound as part of the museum experience? Any different thoughts on that from having done this?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose museums have, there are museums who've done this kind of thing. I suppose in some ways, if it's conflict, there's a nervousness around doing anything that might trigger a person and anything that might be overwhelming. And I suppose sound is one of the ways, but it's an interesting thing about sound, isn't it? That it can touch people in a way that they unexpected, and they won't necessarily be able to protect themselves. But I do think there's such a musicality to these interviews. That's what I feel. This feels to me like a composition. And so, yeah, I think that some kind of an installation in a museum or just a really creative way of representing it, yeah, would be fantastic.
Okay, we're kind of out of time for today, so I'd like to finish by thanking Roisin for coming and speaking on this incredibly important and exciting project. We're really looking forward to the outcomes publications and also collaborations and exhibitions which are going to come out of it. It's extremely resonant for those of us who have our own sensory memories of these horrific decades in the history of the North, but also I think for those of us just thinking about how history can be done in these very different and exploratory ways and ways which lend themselves to collaborations with people working in creative practice and in the arts, as well as in a whole range of other approaches to memory. It's extremely stimulating. Roisin, thank you so much. It's been fantastic. So can we thank you today?